Um, welcome to the Maine Planning Basis webinar. My name is Tom Mariola. I'm a senior planner with the Municipal Planning Assistance Program. These monthly webinars are intended for those that are new to the planning profession. A reminder that these sessions are recorded, and I've posted 3 links in chat already. The first link is to, those of you that are AICP, you can find or apply your credits for this past February's Freedom of Access Act training. And then also the second link is for today's training, those of you that are AICP. And then the third link is just the link to all of the videos that we've had since we started this a couple of years ago. Our next session is Friday, May 1st. Again, we have apologies. We don't have a topic yet, so please feel free. Anyone can suggest a topic. Today's topic is farm viability solutions for municipal planning, creating a farm-friendly community. We welcome Krista Chappell. Krista is the municipal policy planner at Maine Farmland Trust. Krista provides educational and technical assistance to municipalities to support farm-friendly policies and planning initiatives. She has a diverse experience developing partnerships and enjoys collaborating to solve complex issues. Krista formerly served as the president of Greater Portland Council of Governments and was twice elected to the Gray Town Council. So now we know what town you're associated with. Okay. Having served as chair and vice chair. Prior to joining her local council, Krista led Gray's Comprehensive Plan Steering Committee. Congratulations, Krista. Krista, you can begin whenever you'd like.
Okay. Thanks so much, Tom. I'm glad you found my bio. I hadn't given that to you, so that's great. Yep, I do have quite a bit of, I would say, up until this point, citizen-led planning experience, but I've been really glad to be here at Maine Farmland Trust for a little over a year now, just getting into the weeds of what that looks like in terms of agriculture and food security in particular. So thank you for having me here today. Just a little bit about Maine Farmland Trust, for those of you who are not familiar with MFT. Our goal at MFT is to protect Maine farmland and revitalize Maine's rural landscape by keeping agricultural lands working and helping farmers and communities thrive. Since our founding in 1999, we've protected about 57,000 acres of farmland in every single county in the state of Maine, across 345 farms. But beyond farmland conservation, we also work to support farmers themselves and advance the future of farming in Maine. We have members that include individuals, businesses, organizations, municipalities, donors, and other stakeholders statewide. And then we also have farms in our farm network. Either they have a protected easement with Maine Farmland Trust, or they've used some of our farm business services to help with their farm viability. And then for municipalities in particular, we work at federal, state, and municipal level through policy and research and outreach. But at the municipal level, there's much that can be done locally to advance farm-friendly policy, either through town boards or committees, but also individuals that get involved. And Maine Farmland Trust supports Maine towns in this important role that they play by growing local agriculture and sharing informational resources, engaging in community and municipal outreach, education efforts, and providing direct technical assistance. So just a little bit of what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to try to save questions till the end. I think that might just flow a little better. So just keep those in mind as I'm going over the presentation. But I'm going to just dive into a little bit of trends in agriculture, particularly in Maine, and why it's important to support agriculture and farm viability in particular. Then I'm going to we're going to talk about what solutions municipalities can offer to support that farm viability. And then if time dependent, I'm going to show a little video talking about why Maine farms matter, which features Penny Jordan, who's a farmer at Jordan's Farm in Cape Elizabeth, and she's also a local town councilor there. And then we hopefully will have lots of time for questions. So why support agriculture and farm viability? Farms are more than the land they inhabit. They are also often local businesses, and they're impacted by ordinances, and they're definitely important to consider in town planning and policy making. Farms are usually considered in planning related to open space or land use, but they should also be an important consideration in decisions that involve economic development, housing, climate action and resilience, and among many other topics that municipalities touch on. And also farms provide rural character, which is usually very important to communities in Maine, while also providing community benefits, economic benefits, and they offer a unique perspective across many impact areas in local government. So what do some of those benefits look like just in terms of data sources? So agriculture serves as an economic development engine, as I mentioned, for communities and regions in Maine. Agricultural production accounts for over $1 billion in economic impact and yearly, and over 13,000 jobs statewide. And when you add agricultural food processing to that figure, it's another almost $8 million in economic impact and 33,000 jobs. And then on top of that, most of the purchases by farms are made, farm business owners are made locally, and they support a large number of secondary local businesses like veterinary services, feed stores, things of that nature. At the municipal level, there's a fiscal benefit for keeping farms working. 30 years of cost of community services studies that have been compiled by American Farmland Trust show that farmland's net benefit impact on municipal budgets is significant, and that keeping agricultural land, keeping farms farming provides that net benefit to municipal budgets. And ultimately, farmers require a lot less services than other types of development in town. There's also environmental and climate benefits. Undeveloped agricultural land and farmers' use of healthy soil practices like cover crops and reduced tillage mitigate the impacts of climate change, and they sequester carbon and limit greenhouse gases in those open fields. And beyond that, farms often provide many community and food security benefits. They offer recreational access. They serve as community hubs. And as I mentioned, there's local food security, especially in these times of stress on our systems that provide food. And then moreover, Maine Won't Wait, Maine's climate action plan has also set some ambitious goals in support of that. They're aiming to increase locally sourced food consumption to 30% by 2030, and also conserving 30% more farmland. Hopefully you can see some of the numbers on this slide. This data is from the 2022 agricultural census, which is done every 5 years. You'll notice that both the total number of farms and the total acres in farming have declined very significantly from 2012 in Maine, and again from 2017 to 2022. Since 2012, almost 230,000 acres of farmland, which is roughly the size of Saginaw County, has fallen out of agricultural production in Maine, and we've lost over more than 1,100 farms statewide. One thing to note, though, with the land and farms, the acreage figure that you're seeing here as a decrease, the census doesn't indicate whether that land is no longer part of a farm operation. It doesn't tell us that, but what it does mean is, or rather, it is no longer being farmed, but it doesn't tell us what's happened to that land. It doesn't necessarily mean it's been developed. But since the land is no longer part of a farm, it is definitely more vulnerable to development. And then there's a decline in the amount of land in active production. And that can exacerbate challenges, particularly for new and established farmers that are already facing access issues. And you'll also note the vast majority of farms are small farms in Maine. Over 75% have sale values that are less than $25,000. It doesn't decrease their economic impact, as I noted on the slide before, but what that does mean is that most of the farms in Maine are small family farms that have significant contributions to that community feel. And then also farmers are often juggling multiple roles, multiple jobs and responsibilities, and really need to think about how they can diversify their income streams. And that's really where municipalities can play a part. And you'll also note here that nearly 40% of Maine farmers in 2022 were over the age of 65, and significantly less than that were under the age of 45. So succession planning will definitely be essential as more farmers are considering retirement. And just to touch on what that data really speaks to, the cost of land and low density development pressures are increasing statewide for farmers. There's also increasing costs in addition to increasing property taxes, which I think we're all keenly aware of. In Maine, in particular, that we lack access to infrastructure for farmers, particularly in the dairy and meat processing sectors. Things like meat packing facilities and distribution spaces, and those limitations really impact the way farmers can access new markets and diversify their businesses. As I noted, farm succession planning is going to be important, and I want to just note that if you have farmers in your community who are struggling with thinking about what's next for their farm and their farmland, Maine Farmland Trust can help farmers connect to resources to tackle that question. So please reach out. And then lastly, as it applies to this group in particular, there are a lot of communities that have very restrictive ordinances and standards that inhibit effective farm operation and the diversity of those operations, as I mentioned before. So with all that, the good and the bad, I just want to think a little bit about what can towns do? What are some solutions for helping farms thrive? Town governments play an important role in helping farm businesses, and you can ensure that local planning initiatives and ordinances represent the needs of farmers. And in doing so, it helps keep the land working for all of us. Municipalities, like I said, have a lot of power. Towns have regulatory power from zoning boards, conservation or agricultural commissions, planning boards, councils, and towns and cities can guide that important regulatory policy. And one thing I want to note, though, and when thinking about that, it's really important to have farmers engaged in those processes. That's really key because they can identify opportunities to support farm business needs in all those wide-ranging planning and policymaking initiatives. So let's think about what those are. As I mentioned, it's really important to keep farmers engaged. We've consistently heard and seen how impactful farmer voices are for capturing the needs of farm businesses locally. And when farmers are engaged in policy making and planning, it is more likely that policies will be supportive of their businesses. One model for having them effectively engaged is to think about forming an agricultural commission locally. Or you could also have an agricultural committee. Those are just slightly different, but essentially operate similarly. Agricultural committees are similar to other committees in town, conservation commissions, open space committees. They ensure that the needs of agriculture in particular are considered and integrated into various policies and initiatives. They're usually strictly in advisory capacity, not a regulatory body, but they are in the role to make sure planning boards and councils have a go-to source for farmer input when they're thinking about policy change. They can agricultural commissions can be created by a single town, or you might want to think about like a regional entity that hasn't been developed yet in Maine, but there are several regions in Maine who are considering it. Agricultural commissions are more extensively established in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, as their state statutes have supported it more broadly. And there are really excellent models in both of those states if you're interested in looking into those a bit more, and I could point you to some resources. But there are several Maine communities who have adopted agricultural commissions, including Winslow, Durham, Auburn, Elliott, and a couple others. And they're all operating successfully under that model. If there's not enough bandwidth in your community to have a separate agricultural commission, one thing we have been encouraging folks to consider is incorporating agricultural goals and policies and recruiting farmers to sit on conservation commissions, which do exist in other towns under that model. I believe York has a kind of combo commission in that way, and Cumberland also does. And then one thing I'd also like to mention in terms of engaging farmers is really thinking about getting farmers to participate in the governance and planning that's going on locally. Planning boards, comprehensive plan committees, as I said, conservation committees, zoning board of appeals, and even elected offices. It's really important to have farmers uniquely positioned to directly inform that regulatory and policy change that can create supportive environments for farm businesses. We've seen this involvement locally in many towns across Maine, Durham, Brooklyn, Monmouth, Winslow, Auburn, Cape Elizabeth, Unity. And you'll notice as I go through some of the examples I have, these communities that had farmer input are actually the communities that have been most supportive of farm viability and most successful in tackling that. Another thing to consider when thinking about engagement is surveys, particularly during planning initiatives. So taking that extra step to gather feedback and input directly from farmers through a farmer targeted survey. It can be a simple survey with just a few questions or something more involved, but either way, it will result in more informed and targeted and responsive goals and policies. So I just really encourage you and your community to get officials involved with engaging with farmers and thinking about how to get them into those roles that can make an impact. So thinking about regulatory tools, I just want to go over a couple tools here that we've identified as really effective. So when you're thinking about amendments or ordinances that you might adopt, we want to make sure ordinances address the needs and issues that have been identified, as I said, with farmer input that could be most impactful. Many of these, and I want to also note, because Southern Maine has zoning, but many of these regulatory changes can be implemented without zoning, which is definitely applicable to the rest of the state. Individual ordinances can support much of the same uses and needs without creating zoning and districts. So when you're thinking about ordinance changes, in particular, we want to think about land use definitions. The definitions in your land use ordinance in particular should be sufficiently accommodating and flexible and allow farmers to diversify their businesses and respond to changing and economic and climate conditions. They really should allow a broad range of needs, so agricultural activities and infrastructure, things like hoop houses that extend the growing season, agritourism activities, retail sales, and farm worker housing. They should be, like I said, inclusive of those diverse motivations and uses. So do you allow on-farm processing in your community? Is the repair of farm equipment okay? Do you allow commercial kitchens or farm stands? And are any of your ordinance, is there any of your ordinance definitions or the language prohibitive for those things? And then when you're thinking about new development and particularly new residential development, you want to ensure there are appropriate setbacks and buffers, especially when that development is located next to existing agricultural operations. So making sure there's significant year-round vegetative buffers and adequate setbacks next to operational farms is really critical, because it's important for farms to maintain access to the productive soils on their property, regardless of whether it's next to property lines. So some examples of towns that have accomplished these, either through ordinance adoption or adding agricultural definitions to their land use ordinance. Most of these, as I've noted here, are detailed in our municipal guide, which I'll share with you later on, which is on our Maine Farmland Trust website. And these ordinances that I've noted here, they're supportive of farm business environments by creating more easily, they more easily accommodate things like agritourism, and other diverse business operations. As I mentioned, farmers need to diversify their incomes, and agritourism is always a good option to do that. They also allow agricultural operations in a variety of locations in the town, and they've also streamlined standards for that agricultural infrastructure, such as farm worker housing and farm stands. The example of Herman here that I've included, Herman has reiterated the state's right to farm statute in its land use ordinance. And they've really put the impetus on developers to communicate that right to any new residents that abut farm properties. So things that might result in nuisance complaints like noise, odor, dust. Farmers have a right to make those in their operations. And the town of Herman has just made sure that their ordinance explicitly states that. If your town's considering solar development ordinances, we also have a specific resource at Maine Farmland Trust that could help guide that process. And there's many towns who have adopted solar ordinance standards that account for agricultural soils and then dual use purposes for things like sheep grazing, just things to think about when you're thinking about solar. Towns that have been exploring their land use definitions, in particular, those definitions that are related to agriculture, either adding or editing definitions that exist. Durham has actually a new agriculture committee. It's less than 2 years old, and they've been working on adding and revising 9 agricultural related definitions to the Durham land use ordinance. Things like agritourism, agricultural processing, agricultural employee housing, and agricultural storage. It's a group of farmers, 7 farmers that represent a real wide variety of operations, and they've been really digging in and listening to each other about how these town definitions can be supportive of their operations and businesses. They're in the process of getting those definitions approved at the planning board and expect to go to town meeting in 2027 to have them adopted. And what we've really heard from farmers on this committee in particular, have been working with them pretty significantly for the last year and a half, is that the previous definitions that existed in Durham were very vague. There was like one agriculture definition, and it didn't get into the details of what that meant very well. And the vagueness really left a lot of, created a lot of issues with interpretation. So as staff changed, as new business operations were proposed on the farm, one farm would hear something very different than the next about what was allowed. Gorham has also had some success in adopting some language changes. Their comprehensive plan had specific goals to update their land use ordinance to better support farming, and remove burdensome language and also permitting processes. And as they were implementing that, they have adopted a pretty extensive agritourism definition to better reflect the needs of agricultural businesses in Gorham. And they've also changed their permitting and review processes. So it's much easier for farms to do things like stand up a farm stand, operate events on their farm, and get those things approved and built. And Cape Elizabeth also has intentionally created an open-ended ag-related use definition, which allows farmers to increase land use flexibility and opportunities to supplement farming income, provided that operation is secondary to the principal use of agriculture. And we've heard from their planning staff that several farmers have used that interpretation in that definition to construct farm worker housing and also create, as I mentioned, ancillary business enterprises. So that's ordinances and thinking about definitions, but something else that's kind of I don't want to call it an easy win, but an easier thing to tackle is reducing permitting fees and permitting requirements for temporary structures. So high tunnels, hoop houses, greenhouses are most often reasonably relocated or removed without any material damage to the soils. So they really are temporary structures, particularly hoop houses, which rely on poles being put into the ground and then like a piece of fabric or plastic over it. Those things can be removed at a later date. And these structures are becoming more and more important to farm operations. They extend the growing season and they maximize crop production. And they also offer really cost-effective solutions for livestock housing or equipment storage. Reducing these fees and the permitting requirements can be really impactful because permitting fees in some towns are often really cost prohibitive, particularly for those high tunnels and hoop houses. they can often add up to 20 to 50% of the cost of the structure itself. So clearly identifying those structures as being exempt from permitting requirements or really reducing the fees or eliminating them altogether can be very impactful. Moreover, state statute, there was a recent change in the last couple of years, has identified that these types of temporary structures are exempt from MUBEC. And so anything like anything that houses livestock or stores crops really might only need an electrical or plumbing permit rather than a building permit. And as I mentioned, these types of structures really reduce costs for farmers and also create flexibility for their changing needs, whether that's due to climate or just their business and the seasons. Some examples of towns that have undertaken this type of work. Warren and Auburn right now have no permitting fees for any agricultural buildings or structures. And they have very limited any permitting regulations around those. And then I want to note also Bodenham. Bodenham clearly defines greenhouses as different from hoop houses and high tunnels. And then their permitting and fee structures reflect those differences. So greenhouses have a permanent foundation or anchoring system, whereas hoop houses don't. And so hoop houses and high tunnels have no permit or fee, and greenhouses have a reduced fee. One other thing I'd like to call your attention to are property tax support programs, which many communities already know about. But I spoke earlier about the rising costs of production, and property taxes really are a contributor to that. And property taxes are a big issue everywhere in Maine right now. We're highly aware of that. The state is looking at it through a recently established task force. And it's a challenge at the municipal level and for community members across towns. But as farms are land-based businesses and oftentimes also personal residences, we're hearing increasingly about the challenge of property taxes of farmers being able to afford and keep their land and buildings in active agriculture. So one thing you can do at the town level is to really promote existing programs. The current use tax program can be an important source of support in recognizing natural and working lands in their communities. Some towns have taken proactive steps to really get the word out about those programs, particularly towns that have underutilized land. Lots of landowners are not utilizing the program. They want to get the word out about it as an option. Monmouth, for example, drafted a simple letter to all the residences in town, notifying them of the program and encouraging them to apply. The application deadline for that is April 1st, and noting that on your communications is important. And if you want to tackle any of these outreach programs, you certainly don't have to do it alone. We recognize that many communities have limited capacity. For example, Belfast collaborated with Maine Farmland Trust and GrowSmart and DACF, the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, to hold an informational forum on current use programs. So we're happy to do things like that. Another simple thing you can do is many towns have farm properties that have those protected easements that permanently protect the land from development. And you just want to make sure that as your assessor is reviewing those easement terms and taking those into account, it really can have an impact on the assessment value. So just flagging those properties for your assessor and having them review those terms can be important. Another option available to towns for property tax support is something called the Voluntary Municipal Farm Support Program. This is a program that towns can choose to adopt at the local level. It does have, it is state, there are state guidelines, but it provides further reduction on property taxes for land and buildings, which is an important differentiator from the current use tax program. So current use tax programs only provide a reduction on land values, on the land themselves, the property tax values on the land themselves. The Voluntary Municipal Farm Support Program, if adopted locally, reduces taxes on both the land and the buildings, the farm buildings that the operation might have. As of now, Winslow has established the program, and Monmouth also. Winslow did so in 2016, and the materials that they have really are a great example. And I want to note that the assessor was instrumental in the process to establish this program, and then they have also formed an agricultural commission. So as I mentioned before, getting those farmers engaged in these programs can really do a lot at the local level to create support around farms. One thing to note about the Voluntary Municipal Farm Support Program, it does need to be, as I said, adopted locally through an ordinance. And then you create a farm support arrangement application where farms would apply for an easement that the town would manage for it's a temporary easement. The easement used to be a 20-year term, but MFT worked at the last legislative session to actually reduce that easement to 10 years. We heard feedback from both farmers and municipal staff that were considering the program that the 20-year easement was really a bit burdensome. So we've successfully lobbied to have that changed to 10 years. And then also they've created more flexibility for how the program is adopted locally. So we're just really hoping more farms consider that as an option to ease property tax burdens. And just want to note, I am working with DA staff to organize a workshop on the Voluntary Municipal Farm Support Program in May and June. We'll be having an in-person workshop in Augusta, and then also a webinar for folks who aren't able to travel. So reach out if you're interested. Some other low-hanging fruit, I would call it, maybe easy wins, which is always a popular option when thinking about municipal budgets and public funds. Towns can really just be champions for farms in your community. Just building awareness of the value of farms is a low-cost and effective strategy for supporting farms locally. You can use your town's communication channels, list farm businesses on your town website as a resource, create local signage for farms in your community, and then engage the community around an agriculturally focused event. And getting farmers involved in planning those agricultural events is always a good thing too. So little things can go a long way. Gorham created a video that's been on their website to promote hop yard. The town of Lee, New Hampshire has created brochures of all the agricultural resources in town that they distribute locally. And then communities in Maine like Auburn and Winslow host agriculturally focused fall festivals. And Bodenham has created a business directory of farms. So you can really get creative. Something else to think about is, does your town have any municipal property, big or small, that might help build community and support for a farmer's market? Or would it be potentially suitable for smaller farming operations like a community garden? Lots of towns have some property, so just thinking about how to use those creatively is one idea. And then one thing I'd like to touch on before I move to just wrap up mode, some things you might want to consider that are a little bit more out of the box. Development fees and transfer of development rights can really incentivize growth where town infrastructure exists and create opportunities for attainable housing that's closer to services, which can be very important, not just for the larger community, but also when you're thinking about farm labor and creating opportunities for people who work on farms to actually live near those farms. Creating development where it can be supported with the right kind of infrastructure is important. And development transfer fees and also the transfer of development rights model are good ways to do that. New Gloucester has a transfer of development rights model, and Gorham uses development fees pretty successfully. And those development fees fund conservation of farmland in return for creating more density in their growth areas. One other creative thing municipalities can do, as I mentioned before, if you have municipal property, you might actually want to consider, in addition to farmers markets and community gardens, some municipalities are exploring municipal land leases directly to farmers, which is a great way to welcome and create land access opportunities, particularly for new and beginning farmers or people that have been historically underserved in getting started with farming. So does your town have any open plots of land that might be suitable for a farm operation? I want to note that small plots of land can really go a long way. Many diversified farms operate successfully on fairly small acreage. And there's also opportunities for urban agriculture initiatives. I know the town of Brunswick has some ordinances that are supportive of urban agriculture. I want to point you to Land for Good as an organization that has resources about municipal leasing for farms. It's really in-depth content there, and or you could just reach out to me and I could get you those resources. That was a lot. But I just want to reiterate that if you're interested in anything I've touched on today, Maine Farmland Trust offers free technical assistance to towns. We can help you do things like craft farmer surveys or do presentations to public similar to this one. We can help draft goals and strategies for planning initiatives like comprehensive plans. We could also think about doing an agricultural inventory in town to identify farmland that would be ideal for preservation, review and new and existing ordinances to really identify some of that language I talked about earlier, or development fees, or incorporating some of those unique strategies. And we can also do help you prepare some outreach materials for property tax relief. So please reach out. All of the policy and planning strategies I've highlighted today, along with some case studies in more detail, are available on our website for download. I can also mail you some hard copies if that's helpful. I'm going to put a link in the chat to where those are located on our website. So, but please reach out. It's a pretty in-depth book. There are standalone sections to download if you don't want to download the whole thing. But happy to also just be a resource. So feel free to give me a call. So I think we have a little bit of time. This video I wanted to show you was 5 minutes. It is a little bit of words of wisdom from Penny Jordan in Cape Elizabeth. She's a town councilor and a farmer at Jordan's farm. And it's just really touches on some of the things effectively touches on some of the things I talked about today. Didn't really pull together a panel for this conversation, but this is really some great insight. So it's about a 5-minute video. So let me know if anyone can't hear it just in the chat or something, but hopefully this works for you. Hold on one sec. So I just want to thank you all for joining today. I'm sorry to those who the video wasn't working, but I did provide a link for you to watch on your own if you'd like. It's in the chat. But happy to chat, have some questions today, or like I said, feel free to reach out anytime if folks have questions that are come up
Thank
later.
you, Krista. Yeah, so folks can feel free to come up with some questions. I kind of started off was one thing was in the one of your first slides was in the last 10 years, roughly 1,100 farms have ceased operation. That was a slide that was kind of and that sounded, I mean, I don't track the stuff, but it sounded extremely high to me. I'm wondering if that's farmland that has been pulled out of the current use tax program or something, or like parcels pulled out, or is that truly farms as we think of them? Do you know?
It's my understanding it's farms as we think of them. It's data that we've gotten from the USDA Census of Agriculture. So I don't think it's related to current use in particular. It's really just farms that have ceased to operate.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
Then you used agricultural commissions and agricultural committees. That's interchangeable, I assume?
It's somewhat interchangeable. Historically, commissions have had slightly more autonomy, whereas committees really serve in more of a standard committee role, like you would see with like a solid waste committee or something you have locally. Commissions do, similar to conservation commissions locally, have slightly more autonomy, but it's really just a regulatory body, a non-regulatory body that serves in an advisory capacity for both of those. Yeah.
All right. Other questions, folks? I was thinking as you were talking it would have been great to have someone from Winslow on because they seem like the superhero. And I think you answered one of my other questions was who the hell's doing this in Winslow? Like, where's this coming from? But you kind of answered that. I think you said assessor and their ag committee. Yeah, that was news to me. So, questions from anyone? I'd be shocked if there's no questions, but maybe not.
Yeah.
Nobody? Okay. Okay.
It was a lot. It's a lot to take in. I recognize that. I always struggle with like how to whittle down all this information, but everything I talked about is on our website. I provided that link earlier, and please reach out. I'm here as a resource and happy to come speak locally or provide those resources. Yeah.
Yeah, Joan, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have any questions, but Krista, thank you so much for the presentation. It's nice to see the context, how farming is important to not only the community, to the economy, to the state, but to see it in this land use realm. Mm-hmm. And I have in my prior life heard farmers challenge comprehensive plan committees with, you want to preserve the rural character, but you're not doing anything for us. And we are your rural character. If we let these fields grow, you're not going to see anything because it's going to be trees. So great presentation. Really appreciate that you took the time to share your expertise with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I just want to say that we're certainly not anti-growth at Maine Farmland Trust. We recognize the need for housing and things like solar and all those sorts of development pressures. We just really encourage towns to think creatively about how to target that growth so that they're not impacting those working farms and those important soils that are, as Penny mentioned in her video, those are all finite resources that once those soils are gone and they're developed on, the house is developed on it, they're gone forever.
Yep. Okay. Not seeing any more questions. All right. I'd like to thank Aaron Zirko from Town of Yarmouth for organizing the APA credits for this. That's much appreciated. A reminder, our next webinar is Friday, May 1st. Send your topics our way. And thank you, Krista, and everyone have a phenomenal weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. You too. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.